Tonight, we're diving into the life of the man who survived his first day on the job in Raccoon City and never escaped. Leon S. Kennedy, rookie cop, government weapon, living legend. From the zombie outbreak that destroyed his future, to the mission in Spain that made him a hero, to the decades of trauma, impossible choices, and losses that turned an optimist into something far more dangerous. This is Leon's complete story. Subscribe if you haven't. Now, let's begin. Part 1. The history of Leon Scott. Kennedy does not begin with the triumphant blowing of trumpets or the calculated precision of a seasoned warrior, but rather with the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of a hangover and the bitter tang of a broken heart. On the evening of September 29th, 1998, Leon was a 21-year-old man who had effectively failed at the very first hurdle of his professional life. Having recently graduated from the police academy with top honors, he had been assigned to the Raccoon Police Department, a prestigious post in a town that was, until recently, known as a quiet, corporate-funded utopia. However, the tragedy of Leon's entry into the mythos is rooted in a messy, devastating breakup with his girlfriend just days before his move. This personal failure led him to a nameless motel on the outskirts of the county, where he sought a temporary and self-destructive sanctuary in a bottle of whiskey. He drank until the world blurred, falling into a deep, alcohol-induced sleep that caused him to oversleep his first day of work. It was a moment of profound human weakness, a lapse in judgment that would, ironically, become the only reason he survived the initial blood-soaked hours of the city's collapse. Had Leon been on time, he would have been at the precinct when the doors were breached and the officers were slaughtered in their own hallways. Instead, he was a ghost on the highway, driving a jeep into a darkness he could not possibly comprehend. This late arrival is the most critical narrative device in Leon's entire story, as it allowed him to enter the nightmare of Raccoon City with a set of fresh, untainted eyes. While the citizens had spent weeks living through a slow, mounting dread as the cannibal murders escalated, Leon arrived to find the end result of that terror. The transition from the mundane world of highway travel to the surreal landscape of the biohazard occurred with terrifying speed at a Misoil gas station. As he pulled over, the silence of the night felt heavy and wrong, lacking the usual buzz of rural life. Stepping into the station, he moved from the cool autumn air into a chamber of horrors that redefined his entire understanding of reality. He didn't encounter a suspect or a criminal. He encountered a biological anomaly, a man who was no longer a man, devouring the flesh of a fellow officer. The sheer visceral shock of that moment cannot be overstated. Leon was forced to draw his weapon for the first time, not to make an arrest, but to defend his very soul against a predator that defied every law of nature and biology he had ever been taught. This first contact at the gas station was the literal death of Leon's civilian identity. The young man who had overslept because of a breakup died the moment he saw the light leave the eyes of the man he was forced to shoot. The gas station, a symbol of everyday American life, was transformed into a slaughterhouse, signaling that the safety of the old world was gone forever. Leon drove deeper into the heart of the city, not as a reinforcement for the law, but as a lone witness to the absolute extinction of civilization. He was the man who was late for his own funeral, only to find that the world had decided to burn the cemetery down before he could get there. The drive from that gas station into the city limits was a journey through a literal and figurative fog. As Leon crossed the bridge into Raccoon City, the scale of the disaster began to manifest in the wreckage of abandoned cars, and the flickering, lonely glow of streetlights reflecting off pools of blood. Every instinct he possessed as a police officer told him to turn back, to call for help, to follow a protocol that no longer existed. But Leon was burdened by an almost pathological sense of duty, a hero complex that demanded he find the precinct and report for duty, regardless of the carnage. He believed, perhaps naively, that the Raccoon Police Department would be a bastion of order in the chaos. He imagined officers barricaded inside, maintaining the line, protecting the innocent, and waiting for a man like him to join the fight. He did not yet understand that the institutions of man were the first things to rot when the T-virus was unleashed. His journey through the rain-slicked streets was a descent into a silent, urban graveyard, where the only sounds were the distant crackle of fires and the shuffling footsteps of the things that used to be his neighbors. By the time he reached the city center, the idealistic rookie who wanted to make a difference was already being replaced by a survivor who was learning, second by painful second, that the only way to save anyone was to stay alive himself. The setup of Leon's story is a masterpiece of irony. His greatest professional failure, being late for his first shift, became his greatest survival asset, sparing him the initial slaughter so he could become the one man capable of documenting the crime. Part 2. Who Leon Kennedy really was. To truly grasp the magnitude of the hardened, cynical operative Leon Kennedy would eventually become, one must first look at the blinding, almost tragic idealism of the 21-year-old boy who stepped onto the streets of Raccoon City. Leon was never just a rookie cop looking for a stable government job or a way to pay the bills. He was a young man driven by a specific, intense, and deeply personal sense of justice that had been forged in the crucible of childhood trauma. Born into a family with deep and dark ties to organized crime, Leon's earliest memories were not of safety and warmth, but of the cold, looming shadow of the underworld. He had seen the way corruption and violence could tear a family apart from the inside out, and he had witnessed the brutal murder of his relatives when he was still a small child. This was a moment that could have easily broken him, leading him down a path of nihilism or driving him into the same criminal life he had been born into. Instead, he was saved by a compassionate police officer, a man whose single act of bravery and kindness became the singular guiding light for Leon's entire life. Leon didn't just want to be a policeman. He wanted to be the specific kind of savior who had rescued him from the darkness. He wanted to be the thin blue line that stood between the monsters of the world and the innocent people who had no one else to turn to. This background gave Leon a dangerous, almost impossible level of idealism. He was a top-tier graduate of the police academy, a man of remarkable talent and physical capability who could have taken a comfortable assignment in any major city in the country. Instead, he specifically requested to be sent to Raccoon City. He had been following the news reports of the Arklay Mountain murders and the strange, cannibalistic killings occurring on the outskirts of the town. While others saw these reports as a reason to stay away, Leon saw them as a call to action. He believed that something was fundamentally wrong in Raccoon City, and he believed that he was exactly the kind of person who could help fix it. He arrived in the city with a hero complex that was as heavy as his service weapon, convinced that his arrival would somehow tilt the scales back toward justice. He was the embodiment of the good cop, untainted by the cynical politics of the precinct and fiercely committed to the protection of every citizen. This idealism was his greatest strength, giving him the resolve to face horrors that would have driven other men to madness. But it was also his most significant vulnerability. He was a man who wanted to save everyone. And in a city like Raccoon, that desire was a recipe for a lifetime of survivor's guilt. Leon's personality in those early hours was defined by a kind of stubborn, almost beautiful optimism. He genuinely believed in the power of the badge and the sanctity of the law. He believed that if he followed his training, stayed true to his morals, and worked harder than anyone else, he could restore order to the chaos. He didn't realize that he had entered an environment where the laws of man had been entirely overwritten by the laws of biological warfare. The Raccoon City outbreak was not a criminal case to be solved. It was a systematic dismantling of everything Leon believed in. The tragedy of his character arc is that the city was perfectly designed to break a man exactly like him. Every person he failed to save, every colleague he found dead, and every horrific mutation he encountered was a hammer blow against the foundation of his soul. In the beginning, Leon was a boy who thought he could be a hero. By the time the night was over, he would realize that being a hero in a world of biological monsters often meant making impossible choices that would haunt him for decades. His hero complex wasn't a delusion of grandeur, but a sincere belief in the value of human life. A value that the Umbrella Corporation had decided was entirely negotiable. This foundational decency is what makes his eventual transition into a cold, government weapon so heartbreaking. He started his journey as a man who wanted to save the world, only to find out that the world didn't want to be saved. It just wanted to be survived. Part 3. First Night in Hell. The transition from the outskirts of the city to its burning heart was a descent into a literal and figurative hell that obliterated every vestige of Leon's police academy training within a matter of hours. Shortly after his terrifying encounter at the gas station, Leon crossed paths with Claire Redfield, a civilian who had come to the city searching for her missing brother, Chris. Their meeting was a brief, desperate collision of two souls in the dark, and it was punctuated by a catastrophic tanker explosion that physically and symbolically tore them apart. This explosion forced Leon to navigate the city's urban center alone, separating him from the only other living human he had encountered. This isolation was the final severing of Leon's ties to the world of the living. As he fought his way through the rain, slicked, zombie-infested streets toward the Raccoon Police Department, he was driven by a singular, desperate hope that the precinct would be a sanctuary. He believed that behind those heavy, neoclassical walls, he would find the structure, the leadership, and the resources he needed to make sense of the nightmare. However, the RPD was not a fortress. It was a grand, architectural tomb. The building itself, a former art museum, was a grotesque irony of beauty and culture, now filled with the stench of rot and the echoes of the damned. The marble floors were slick with the blood of the men Leon was supposed to call his brothers. As he moved through the halls, he found a precinct that had been transformed into a charnel house. The most pivotal and psychologically devastating moment of this first night occurred when Leon encountered Lieutenant Marvin Branner. Finding the senior officer mortally wounded in the main hall was a crushing blow to Leon's remaining morale. Marvin was the veteran officer Leon had hoped to learn from, a man of dignity and experience who was now struggling to keep his own organs inside his body. Marvin's final interaction with Leon was a brutal, necessary lesson in the new reality of the world. He told Leon to don't hesitate, a command that was both tactical advice and a spiritual warning. Marvin forced Leon to understand that the things shambling through the hallways were no longer people. They were biological husks, and any hesitation born of Leon's misplaced morality would only lead to his own death. Watching Marvin Branner succumb to the infection and being forced to witness the total collapse of the RPD's chain of command was the moment Leon's training became officially and permanently obsolete. He wasn't performing police work. He was conducting a series of grim mercy killings in a building that had failed its most basic function. The RPD, which should have been the safest place in the city, had become a maze of traps and horrors where the law was powerless. This first night in hell taught Leon that in the face of a biohazard, the social contract is the first thing to burn. He realized that the government and the police were not coming to save him. He was a lone officer in a city that had been abandoned by its creators. The psychological weight of this realization was immense. He was no longer just fighting for his life. He was fighting to maintain some shred of his humanity as he stepped over the corpses of his colleagues. By the time he found his way into the deeper, secret passages of the station, the idealistic rookie was gone, replaced by a man who moved with a grim, mechanical efficiency. He had learned that the only way to survive was to accept that everyone he knew was dead, and that the only law that mattered now was the law of the gun. The first night in hell was his true graduation, a baptism in fire and blood that prepared him for a lifetime of fighting the things that come out of the dark. Part 4. Meeting Ada Wong. In the suffocating, oil-scented darkness of the RPD's underground parking garage, Leon Kennedy encountered the woman who would become the original sin of his emotional life, Ada Wong. In the version of the nightmare that would become canonical, Ada presented herself as a high-level FBI agent on a clandestine mission to investigate the corporate corruption of the Umbrella Corporation. She was everything that Leon, in his state of shock and confusion, desperately needed. She was calm, she was authoritative, and she represented the idea that the federal government was still in control of the situation. Leon, still clinging to his identity as a protector and naturally inclined toward a chivalrous, almost old-fashioned sense of duty toward women, was immediately drawn to her. He didn't just see a partner. He saw a lifeline to the world he thought he had lost. He wanted to believe in Ada because if she was real, then his own life and his own beliefs still had meaning. The relationship between Leon and Ada is the defining femme fatale dynamic of the entire series, a complex dance of attraction, manipulation, and betrayal that would haunt Leon for nearly 30 years. Ada recognized Leon's fundamental goodness and his hero complex within minutes of meeting him. She saw that he was a man who could be steered by his heart, and she used that vulnerability to turn him into a tool for her own objectives. She led him through the shadows, allowing him to protect her and believing his own lies about her role, while she pursued a mercenary agenda that had nothing to do with the FBI or the safety of the citizens. Yet, the tragedy of their connection is that it wasn't entirely one-sided. Even as she lied to him, Ada seemed to be genuinely affected by Leon's stubborn, almost impossible purity. In a world of corporate monsters and cold-blooded killers, Leon was a genuine human being, and that was something Ada hadn't encountered in a very long time. For Leon, Ada was the one who got away before he even had her. She represented a life of shared secrets and mutual capability, a partnership that felt like it was forged in the heat of battle. This meeting in the garage was the beginning of an emotional addiction that Leon would never truly shake. He spent the rest of his life chasing the ghost of the woman he thought he met in the RPD, always hoping that the agent was the true person and the mercenary was the mask. Even after her betrayal was laid bare, he could never quite bring himself to view her as an enemy. This emotional compromise is the core of Leon's character. He is a man of absolute duty to the state, but he is a man of absolute devotion to a woman who stands in opposition to that state. Meeting Ada Wong didn't just change the tactical parameters of his mission, it altered the very architecture of his soul. It ensured that Leon would never be truly whole, and that he would always be looking for a flash of red in the fog of every biohazard zone he entered. He was a man who had survived a city of zombies, only to be taken captive by a single woman's gaze. This relationship is the original sin because it proved that even the most disciplined soldier can be compromised by his own heart. And for Leon, that compromise would become a permanent part of his identity. He became a man who walked a lonely path between duty and desire, forever anchored to a woman who existed only in the shadows of his memory. Part 5. Mr. X. The Stalker. As if the thousands of shambling, mindless dead and the grotesque mutations of the RPD were not enough of a challenge, the Umbrella Corporation decided to deploy a more surgical and terrifying nightmare into the precinct. The T-00 Tyrant, more commonly known as Mr. X. For Leon, the arrival of this silent, trench-coated giant represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. Up until this point, the enemies Leon had faced were the remnants of humanity. Monsters, certainly, but they were disorganized, mindless, and lacked a specific intent. Mr. X was different. He was a calculated, industrial strength executioner with a dual mandate that demonstrated the absolute coldness of his creators. He was to retrieve a sample of the G virus, and he was to terminate any and all RPD survivors who might serve as witnesses to Umbrella's crimes. The psychological impact of being stalked by Mr. X was profound and immediate. The sound of his heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoing through the hollowed-out halls of the station became the terrifying heartbeat of Leon's journey. Mr. X represented an insurmountable physical threat that could not be bargained with, could not be arrested, and for a very long time could not even be wounded. He was the physical manifestation of Umbrella's reach, a reminder that the corporation viewed human life, including the life of a police officer like Leon, as nothing more than a loose end to be tied. The presence of the stalker forced Leon to undergo a rapid and necessary psychological evolution. He had to move away from his protect and serve mindset and enter a state of pure survival. Mr. X stripped away any remaining illusion of control. In the face of such an unstoppable force, Leon had to learn to navigate his environment with a predator's instinct, learning to run when he couldn't fight and to hide when he couldn't run. This was Leon's first true lesson in the terrifying scale of the conspiracy he had stumbled into. This wasn't a biological accident. It was a deliberate deployment of a killing machine against a civilian population. The psychological terror of Mr. X lay in his silence and his persistence. He didn't scream, he didn't gloat, and he didn't tire. He simply walked, an inevitable force of corporate malice that shattered Leon's sense of safety forever. He taught Leon that the monsters of the world were not just accidents of science, but were manufactured in boardrooms and labs, designed to be efficient, silent, and absolute in their lethality. This encounter with the T-00 Tyrant broke something inside Leon. It destroyed his belief that he could handle any situation through traditional means. It forced him to realize that if he wanted to survive in Umbrella's world, he had to become something more than a man with a badge. He had to become a weapon himself, a silver bullet that could survive the impact of a giant's fist. The battle with Mr. X was the final exam of Leon's first night, proving that he was no longer a rookie, but a survivor who had looked into the eyes of a manufactured god and refused to blink. The stalker didn't just hunt Leon, he forged him into a soldier, ensuring that for the rest of his life, Leon would always be listening for the sound of heavy footsteps in the dark, ready to fight a war that never truly ends. Part 6. Umbrella's Underground. The true, horrifying scope of the Raccoon City disaster was finally revealed when Leon Kennedy descended into the bowels of the earth, discovering the Nest, a massive state-of-the-art laboratory hidden directly beneath the residential streets of the city. This descent was more than just a change in location. It was a literal and symbolic journey into the heart of the darkness that had consumed the world. Here, in the sterile, high-tech corridors of the Nest, Leon discovered the existence of the G virus, a mutagen far more volatile, powerful, and terrifying than the T virus that had turned the city into a graveyard. He learned of the brilliant but megalomaniacal William Birkin, the man who had traded his humanity for a chance at biological godhood. Seeing the industrial scale of this facility, the gleaming white hallways, the vats of bubbling chemicals, and the sophisticated security systems, changed Leon's worldview forever. He realized that the monsters were not the zombies on the street, nor even the tyrant in the station. The true monsters were the suited executives and the ambitious scientists who had monetized the end of the world. The realization that a corporation had built a palace of death beneath a city filled with families was a crushing blow to Leon's remaining faith in the structures of society. He saw that Umbrella had effectively turned the entire population of Raccoon City into a collection of disposable test subjects, an urban laboratory where they could refine their weapons of mass destruction. This discovery turned Leon's mission from one of simple survival into a quest for systemic exposure and revenge. He was no longer just an officer trying to get out of a burning city. He was a witness to a crime against humanity that defied description. The Nest laboratory was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof that the outbreak was not a tragic accident, but the result of calculated corporate greed and a total lack of ethical restraint. Leon understood that as long as this technology existed, and as long as these people were in power, the world would never be safe. This transition from a rookie cop to an anti-umbrella crusader was solidified in the cold, pressurized air of the underground labs. Leon saw the G virus, a pulsing, glowing vial of pure biological chaos, and he understood the ultimate hubris of man. He realized that the world he once knew, the world of law and order and simple justice, had been an illusion maintained by the very people who were now burning it all down for profit. He left the labs with a singular, burning goal: to ensure that Umbrella would pay for what they had done. However, he did not yet realize that the corporation's roots were tangled deep within the very government he served, and that his quest for justice would eventually lead him into a different kind of imprisonment. The underground labs were the birthplace of the Agent Kennedy that would dominate the future, a man who knew the truth and was willing to walk through hell to stop it from spreading. He emerged from the earth as a man who had seen the face of the devil in a white lab coat, and he knew that for the rest of his life there would be no peace as long as the legacy of William Birkin remained. Part 7. Ada's Fall. As the Nest facility began its final, screaming self-destruct sequence, the fragile web of lies and manipulation surrounding Ada Wong finally collapsed, leaving Leon Kennedy in a state of profound and agonizing emotional devastation. The truth was revealed in the most brutal and clinical way possible. Ada was not an FBI agent. She was not a partner, and she was not a friend. She was a high-level mercenary hired to retrieve a sample of the G virus for a mysterious third party. She had used Leon from the moment they met, exploiting his hero complex and his fundamental decency to navigate the horrors of the city, all while she planned to disappear with the very thing that had caused all the death. Yet, the tragedy of Leon's character is that even when the betrayal was laid bare, he could not simply turn his heart off. When Ada was seemingly killed, falling into the yawning, lightless chasm of the facility as it crumbled around them, Leon was left with a lingering, hollow sense of loss that would never truly heal. He stood at the edge of the abyss, reaching for a woman who had lied to him with every breath, and in that moment, he realized that he was irrevocably changed. He had lost the woman he thought he loved, but more importantly, he had lost the version of himself that was capable of trusting someone so completely. He was a man who had survived a literal apocalypse, only to be broken by a single act of betrayal. Leon's escape from the burning facility was not a triumphant victory, but a desperate and sorrowful retreat. He boarded an emergency train with Claire Redfield and the young Sherry Birkin, the daughter of the man whose ego had started the fire. As the train sped out of the tunnels and into the morning air of October 1st, 1998, a nuclear strike sterilized Raccoon City, turning a home of 100,000 people into a radioactive scar on the landscape. Leon watched the mushroom cloud rise in the distance, a final, violent punctuation mark on the first chapter of his life. He had entered Raccoon City as an idealistic rookie cop. He left it as a survivor with a permanent, invisible scar on his soul. He had survived the zombies. He had survived the tyrant, and he had survived the explosion of the city, but he had not survived the loss of his innocence. He looked at Sherry, a child whose parents were dead, whose home was gone, and whose very DNA had been tampered with by her father's monstrous legacy, and he felt a crushing, unbearable weight of responsibility. He had failed to save the city, he had failed to save his fellow officers, and he had failed to save the woman he loved. The only thing he had left was his life, and the duty he now felt toward the girl sitting beside him. Leon Scott Kennedy left the ashes of Raccoon City as a man who knew the true face of the world, and he knew that for the rest of his life, he would be hunting the monsters that Umbrella had left behind. He was no longer a boy. He was a witness to the end of the world, and the silence of the morning after was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Part 8, Blackmailed into Service. The survival of Leon Kennedy and Sherry Birkin did not lead to a period of quiet recovery or a return to civilian life, but rather to a new and sophisticated kind of imprisonment within the very government Leon had once admired. Shortly after escaping the radioactive remains of Raccoon City, Leon and Sherry were intercepted by United States government operatives. They were not greeted as heroes or survivors, but as dangerous liabilities and valuable assets. High-ranking official Adam Benford, a man who would eventually rise to the presidency, recognized the immense value of Leon's first-hand experience and the dangerous level of knowledge he possessed regarding the clandestine and illegal ties between the American government and the Umbrella Corporation. Leon was brought into a sterile, windowless interrogation room and given a choice that was no choice at all. The government needed a silver bullet, a highly skilled first-hand witness who could be trained into an elite operative to clean up biological messes, and they knew exactly how to force Leon's hand. They utilized the only thing Leon had left, his protective instinct for Sherry Birkin. The government officials made it explicitly clear that if Leon did not agree to enter into their service, Sherry would be treated as a permanent lab rat, a biological curiosity to be kept in a cage and studied for the rest of her life due to her exposure to the G virus. This moment of blackmail was the final and absolute death of Leon's freedom. To protect Sherry's life, her dignity, and her future, Leon surrendered his own, agreeing to join a secret, high-level anti-bioterrorism agency. He was no longer a civilian or a local police officer. He was a government-owned asset, a lethal tool to be wielded by the state in shadows he could never have imagined. This transition was profoundly cynical and deeply wounding to Leon's moral compass. He was being forced to work for the same government that had, at least in part, allowed Umbrella to thrive and had eventually nuked its own citizens to cover up its involvement. His service was born of coercion, not patriotism. He became a silver bullet for the state, a man who would do the dirty work that the American public could never be allowed to know about. This period of his life was defined by a quiet, simmering resentment and a total, obsessive focus on the mission at hand, as any failure on his part could mean the end of Sherry's safety. He was a prisoner in a tactical suit, a hero by force, and a man who had traded his soul to save a child. This foundational betrayal by his own country ensured that Leon would never again trust authority without absolute reservation, even as he became its most lethal and effective instrument. He was a man who lived a lie every day, serving a system he knew was corrupt to protect a girl who was the only innocent thing left in his world. This was the beginning of his transformation into the ghost of the man he used to be. Part 9. The Training Years. From late 1998 to 2002, Leon Kennedy underwent a total psychological and physical metamorphosis, transforming from the traumatized, shell-shocked survivor of Raccoon City into the lethally efficient and cold-blooded operative the world would come to fear. Under the strict, relentless supervision of government handlers, Leon was subjected to a grueling special forces training program, designed to strip away his human weaknesses and hone his reflexes into something bordering on the superhuman. He was pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance, mastering firearms proficiency, advanced tactical maneuvers, and the brutal, close-quarters, knife-fighting skills that would eventually become his signature on the battlefield. He was no longer reacting to the horror of biohazards. He was learning how to control and eliminate them with surgical precision. This was not the training of a police officer. This was the forging of a weapon of war. The government didn't want a man who questioned the ethics of his orders. They wanted a ghost who could infiltrate a high-risk zone, eliminate a biological threat, and vanish without a single trace. During these 4 long and lonely years, Leon made the conscious and painful decision to suppress his emotions entirely. He buried the grief for his fallen comrades, the confusion over his feelings for Ada Wong, and the deep resentment he felt toward his handlers beneath a thick layer of cold, professional detachment. He focused entirely on his duty, knowing that his performance was the only thing keeping Sherry Birkin safe from the government's scientific curiosity. He became a man of few words and absolute devastating action. His body was rebuilt with muscle and scar tissue, and his mind was sharpened into a tactical instrument capable of analyzing a threat in milliseconds. He learned to operate alone in the most hostile environments on Earth, becoming the ultimate lone wolf operative. This period was a dark and isolated time for Leon, a transition from the boy he had been in the RPD to the Agent Kennedy the world needed him to be. He had sacrificed his youth, his freedom, and his emotional well-being to become the most dangerous man in the service of the United States. When he finally emerged from these secret training programs, he was a silent, lethal professional, a man who could walk into a room of monsters and not feel a single pulse of fear because he had already been burned to the very core of his being. He was the state's most effective secret, a man who had replaced his heart with a mission and his idealism with a gun. He was ready for the world, but the world was not ready for him. Part 10. Operation Xavier. In the year 2002, the newly forged Agent Leon Kennedy was deployed on his first major international mission, an operation that would test every ounce of the training he had endured over the previous 4 years. Known as Operation Xavier, Leon was paired with a seasoned, highly decorated, and legendary veteran soldier named Jack Krauser. They were sent deep into the sweltering, oppressive jungles of South America with a singular, high-stakes objective: to capture Javier Hidalgo, a powerful and ruthless drug lord who had reportedly acquired samples of Umbrella's T. Veronica virus. This mission served as Leon's first official cleanup of Umbrella's lingering and toxic legacy, and it proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that his years of grueling training had elevated him to a level of capability that very few humans on the planet could match. Navigating the dense, humid jungle while battling the horrific biological monstrosities that Hidalgo had unleashed, Leon demonstrated a level of tactical brilliance and physical prowess that even the veteran Krauser was forced to respect. However, Operation Xavier was far more than just a combat mission. It was a profound and difficult ethical crucible for Leon. During the operation, they encountered Manuela Hidalgo, Javier's daughter, whose life was being artificially and cruelly sustained by the very virus Leon had been sent to destroy. Leon was forced to once again confront the grey areas of biomedical ethics, realizing that the line between a monster and a victim was often blurred by those in power. He did not see Manuela as a biological weapon or a target. He saw a terrified girl being used as a tool by her own father, a situation that mirrored the trauma he had seen in Sherry Birkin. This mission solidified Leon's role as a protector of the innocent, even when that innocent was the very source of the biological threat he was supposed to eliminate. It also highlighted the growing and dangerous disparity between Leon and his partner, Jack Krauser. While Leon fought to save Manuela and contain the virus out of a deep-seated sense of duty and humanity, he began to notice Krauser's growing and unhealthy obsession with the raw, godlike power that the biological weapons possessed. Operation Xavier was a tactical success in that Hidalgo was defeated and the T. Veronica virus was contained, but it planted the seeds of a future betrayal that would haunt Leon for many years to come. It proved that Leon was indeed the silver bullet the government wanted, but it also showed that even in the heat of the jungle, he still carried the idealistic heart of the rookie who had arrived in Raccoon City late, trying his absolute best to save everyone he could. He returned from South America as a proven elite, but with the chilling realization that the war against biohazards was not just being fought in labs, but in the hearts of the soldiers standing right next to him. Part 11. Krauser's Descent. The aftermath of Operation Xavier in 2002 was not merely a conclusion to a mission, but the beginning of a profound and tragic ideological divergence between Leon Kennedy and his partner, Jack Krauser. While Leon emerged from the jungles of South America with his moral compass intact, albeit burdened by the weight of what he had seen, Krauser returned as a broken man, both physically and psychologically. During the heat of the conflict, Krauser had sustained a severe injury to his arm, a wound that effectively ended his career as an elite soldier in the traditional sense. For a man like Krauser, who defined his entire existence by his physical prowess and his utility on the battlefield, this injury was a death sentence. He began to view his own human fragility with a growing sense of loathing. and he looked at the raw, godlike power of the biological weapons they had fought with a mixture of terror and envy. He saw in the T. Veronica virus not just a threat to be eliminated, but a potential cure for his own perceived weakness. This was the moment the seeds of betrayal were sown, as Krauser began to resent Leon's special status with the government and his seemingly effortless ability to maintain his humanity while excelling in the theater of war. Krauser's descent into darkness was fueled by a toxic cocktail of professional jealousy and a sudden, desperate thirst for power. He believed that the United States government had used him and then discarded him the moment he became less than a perfect weapon. In his mind, Leon was the favored son, the silver bullet who was given every advantage, while Krauser was left to rot with a ruined arm. This resentment drove him into the arms of the very enemies he had spent his life fighting. Shortly after the mission, Krauser faked his own death in a helicopter crash, a calculated move that allowed him to disappear from the government's radar and seek out a new master, Albert Wesker. He believed that by joining Wesker and the shadowy organizations that sought to harness the power of biohazards, he could transcend his human limitations and regain the strength he had lost. For Leon, the news of Krauser's death was a bitter pill to swallow, as he truly respected the man as a mentor and a comrade. He mourned the loss of a brother in arms, unaware that Krauser was actually undergoing a horrific transformation, trading his soul for a biological edge that would eventually bring them into a lethal confrontation. The tragedy of Krauser's descent lies in the fact that it served as a dark mirror for Leon's own path. Both men were used by the state. Both were traumatized by the horrors of Raccoon City and beyond, and both were forced to live lives of secrecy and violence. However, while Leon used his trauma as a catalyst to protect the innocent, Krauser allowed his trauma to consume him, turning his pain into a weapon of war. He abandoned the code of the soldier for the path of the mercenary, believing that in a world of monsters, the only way to survive was to become the greatest monster of all. This betrayal was a foundational lesson for Leon. It taught him that even the most disciplined and decorated soldiers could be corrupted by the allure of biological power. It proved that the war they were fighting was not just on the battlefield, but within the human heart. When Leon would eventually face Krauser again, years later, he wouldn't just be fighting a former partner. He would be fighting a version of himself that had given up hope. Krauser's descent was the ultimate proof that the legacy of Umbrella was not just in the viruses they created, but in the way they poisoned the souls of the men who tried to stop them. Part 12. Assignment: Rescue the President's Daughter. By the year 2004, the transformation of Leon Kennedy was complete. He was no longer the rookie cop or the uncertain survivor. He was the premier agent for the Division of Security Operations, an elite branch of the government that answered directly to the highest levels of power. Leon had become the president's personal silver bullet, a man whose reputation for handling the impossible was legendary within the intelligence community. It was because of this peerless record that he was personally selected by President Graham for a mission of the utmost sensitivity: the rescue of his kidnapped daughter, Ashley Graham. This was not a standard military operation. It was a lone wolf mission into the remote, mountainous regions of rural Spain. Leon was chosen not just for his lethal skills, but for his integrity. In a world where intelligence agencies were often compromised by corporate interests or hidden agendas, the president knew that Leon was the only person he could trust to prioritize Ashley's life above all else. especially if the kidnapping involved the biological threats Leon had spent 6 years neutralizing. Arriving in Spain, Leon found himself in an environment that felt like a step back in time, yet permeated with a familiar, cloying sense of dread. The rural villages were isolated, the people were hostile, and the atmosphere was thick with a silence that screamed of hidden horrors. This mission was a test of Leon's autonomy. He was thousands of miles from any support, operating in a country where his presence was officially unauthorized, and facing a threat that he did not yet understand. He wasn't fighting the shambling zombies of Raccoon City or the industrial tyrants of the RPD. He was stepping into a localized nightmare that felt more like an ancient cult than a corporate conspiracy. The briefing had been sparse, but Leon's instincts were on high alert from the moment he stepped out of the car. He knew that the kidnapping of the president's daughter was more than a simple ransom plot. It was an attack on the very heart of the American government, and he was the only man standing between the world and a catastrophic political fallout. The assignment to rescue Ashley Graham redefined Leon's role in the global fight against bioterrorism. He was no longer just cleaning up the messes left by Umbrella. He was acting as a proactive defender of the executive branch. This mission required a level of finesse and tactical adaptability that went far beyond his previous experiences. He had to be a detective, an infiltrator, and a one-man army all at once. The isolation of rural Spain served to highlight Leon's growth as an operative. He moved through the landscape with a cold, professional grace, his mind constantly analyzing the environment for threats. He was the embodiment of the perfect agent, lethal, focused, and utterly committed to the objective. Yet beneath the surface, the weight of the mission was immense. If he failed, the president's daughter would die, and the security of the United States would be compromised. Leon Kennedy walked into the Spanish village, not knowing that he was about to face a new kind of biological evolution, one that would force him to push his training and his resolve to their absolute breaking point. He was a man on a mission of redemption, hoping that by saving one girl, he could finally find some peace for all those he had lost in the past. Part 13, The Village Siege. The moment Leon Kennedy entered the first village in rural Spain, he realized with a chilling certainty that the rules of biological warfare had changed once again. He encountered the ganados, villagers who appeared at first glance to be normal humans, but who possessed a terrifying, collective malice that defied explanation. Unlike the slow, mindless, and predictable zombies he had fought in Raccoon City, these enemies were coordinated, intelligent, and communicative. They used tools, they set traps, and they moved with a frightening sense of purpose. This was Leon's first encounter with the Las Plagas parasite, a discovery that proved biological weapons were evolving away from the chaotic rot of the T virus and towards something far more controlled and insidious. The iconic village siege remains a cornerstone of Leon's legend, a frantic and visceral battle where he was forced to hold off an entire community of infected madmen. This siege was the ultimate proving ground for Leon's 6 years of elite training. He was surrounded, outgunned, and facing a brand of horror he had never encountered before. The ganados didn't just shuffle toward him. They screamed in a language he barely understood. They climbed through windows, and they coordinated their attacks to corner him. The arrival of the chainsaw-wielding villager, a man whose face was hidden by a sack and whose only goal was Leon's decapitation, added a layer of primal, slasher movie terror to the tactical combat. Leon had to use every inch of his environment to survive, demonstrating a level of agility and resourcefulness that was far beyond his rookie days. He wasn't just shooting targets. He was managing a chaotic 360-degree battlefield where every mistake could be his last. The roar of the chainsaw and the frantic cries of un forastero created a soundscape of pure nightmare, forcing Leon into a state of hyper-focused survival. The village siege proved that Leon Kennedy had become more than just a survivor. He had become a master of the impossible. He fought with a mechanical efficiency, his movements a blur of reloads, parries, and precision shots. This battle served as a clear message to the player and to the world of Resident Evil. Leon was no longer the boy who arrived late to Raccoon City. He was a lethal professional who could stand his ground against an entire village of monsters and come out the other side. The shift from the mindless dead to the coordinated ganados was a narrative masterstroke that reflected Leon's own evolution. As the enemies became smarter and more organized, so did he. He realized that the Las Plagas were not an accident, but a weaponized form of social control. The siege ended, not because Leon had killed everyone, but because a mysterious bell tolled, calling the villagers away to their worship. This left Leon standing alone in the bloodied square, the silence of the village feeling more oppressive than the screams. He knew then that he wasn't just rescuing a girl. He was dismantling a cult that had successfully weaponized the very souls of its followers. Part 14, Luis Serra, the regretful scientist. In the midst of the Spanish nightmare, Leon Kennedy encountered a man who would serve as a poignant narrative mirror to the tragic figures of his past. Luis Serra, a former researcher who had worked for the Los Iluminados cult. Luis was a man defined by a charming, roguish exterior that masked a deep and festering well of regret. He was a scientist who had realized too late that his intellectual curiosity had provided a monster with the keys to the kingdom. In many ways, Luis was the redemption version of William Birkin. While Birkin had embraced the mutation and the power of his work until the very end, Luis spent his final days trying to undo the damage he had caused. He became an unlikely and essential ally for Leon, providing the agent with critical intel on the Las Plagas parasite and the medicine needed to suppress the infection that had already taken hold of both Leon and Ashley. The dynamic between Leon and Luis was one of mutual, albeit guarded, respect. Leon, ever the pragmatist, was initially suspicious of Luis's motives, but he soon recognized the genuine fear and remorse in the man's eyes. Luis represented the human cost of scientific hubris. He was a man who had seen the god that Sadler was building and had been horrified by it. He provided Leon with a bridge to understanding the biological mechanics of the cult, explaining that the Las Plagas were not just a disease, but a sentient hierarchy that could be controlled. This information was vital for Leon's survival, as it allowed him to understand that he wasn't just fighting monsters, but a sophisticated biological network. Luis's presence reminded Leon that not everyone involved in the creation of these horrors was a villain. Some were simply fools who had been blinded by the allure of discovery. The death of Luis Serra at the hands of Osmond Sadler was a devastating blow to Leon, adding another heavy layer to his already profound survivor's guilt. Luis died in an attempt to deliver the final pieces of the puzzle to Leon, a sacrifice that allowed the mission to continue, but left Leon once again mourning a man who had died because of his proximity to the fight. Luis's final moments, where he expressed a simple desire to be a good person, resonated deeply with Leon's own struggles with his moral compass. For Leon, Luis was a reminder that even in a world of absolute rot, redemption was possible through action. Luis gave his life to save a girl he barely knew, and to help a man he had just met, proving that the human spirit could still flicker in the darkness of the Los Iluminados cult. Leon carried Luis's memory with him as he pushed deeper into the castle, his resolve hardened by the knowledge that he was now carrying the weight of yet another man's sacrifice. He wasn't just rescuing Ashley for the president anymore. He was doing it to honor the man who had died to give them a fighting chance. Part 15. Finding Ashley Graham. Locating. Ashley Graham in the labyrinthine, trap-filled halls of Ramon Salazar's castle was the moment Leon Kennedy's role shifted from a lone survivor to a true protector. Finding the president's daughter was not the end of the mission, but the beginning of a far more complex and dangerous phase. Ashley was terrified, infected, and entirely out of her element. Yet she looked to Leon with a level of trust that was both touching and terrifying for him. For Leon, Ashley was more than just a high-value asset. She was a physical manifestation of the innocence he had failed to protect in Raccoon City. Protecting her became his singular obsession, a way to prove to himself that he could actually save someone from the fire. Their dynamic was a study in mutual growth, as Leon had to learn how to guide a civilian through a war zone, while Ashley had to find the courage to follow a man who lived in the shadows. The journey through the castle was a psychological and physical gauntlet. Salazar, the diminutive and deranged Castellan, treated the entire pursuit as a sadistic game, using the architecture of his home to separate Leon and Ashley at every turn. Leon had to manage the constant threat of the Ganados and the monstrous Garradors, while ensuring that Ashley remained unharmed. This escort dynamic, often criticized for its mechanical difficulty, is narratively essential for Leon's character. It forced him to be more than a killer. It forced him to be a guardian. Every time Ashley was snatched away or put in danger, Leon's hero complex was triggered, driving him to perform feats of incredible bravery to get her back. He taught her how to hide, how to move, and how to trust his voice above the screams of the monsters. In turn, Ashley's presence humanized Leon, pulling him out of his cold, professional shell and reminding him of what he was actually fighting for. Furthermore, the mission was complicated by the fact that both Leon and Ashley were fighting a ticking clock within their own bodies. The Las Plagas parasites were growing, slowly exerting their influence over their nervous systems. This shared infection created a profound bond between the two. They were both victims of the same cult, both facing the prospect of losing their identities to a foreign organism. Leon's resolve to find a cure for Ashley before himself was the ultimate testament to his character. He was willing to become a monster if it meant she could return home as a human. This phase of the mission, set against the backdrop of the grotesque, gold-leafed horror of Salazar's castle, showed that Leon's greatest strength was not his marksmanship, but his capacity for empathy. By the time they escaped the castle and moved toward the final island facility, the relationship between Leon and Ashley had evolved from a rescue mission into a partnership of survival. Leon had found a new sense of purpose, and Ashley had found the one man in the world who would never stop coming for her. Part 16. Ada returns again. In the midst of the biological chaos and the ancient religious fervor of the Spanish mission, a familiar ghost from Leon Kennedy's past reappeared. Ada Wong. Her sudden presence in the rural village and the sprawling castle threw Leon into a state of profound emotional turmoil. It had been 6 years since they had last seen each other in the burning ruins of Raccoon City, and while Leon had spent those years becoming a government weapon, Ada had remained in the shadows, her true allegiance as elusive as ever. Her reappearance confirmed Leon's worst fears. She was still alive, she was still beautiful, and she was still working for the enemy. Specifically, she was in Spain on behalf of Albert Wesker, tasked with retrieving a sample of the dominant Las Plagas parasite. Their cat-and-mouse game resumed instantly, a deadly flirtation set against a backdrop of global catastrophe. For Leon, Ada's return was a reminder of his original sin, the fact that he could never truly separate his feelings from his duty when she was involved. Despite everything he knew about her mercenary nature, he found himself once again falling into a pattern of mutual assistance and hidden agendas. Ada provided Leon with keys, intel, and occasional backup, often arriving just in time to save him from a fatal encounter. Yet, she always kept him at arm's length, her separate mission ensuring that they could never truly be on the same side. This dynamic was a source of constant frustration for Leon. He wanted to believe she was there to help him save Ashley, but he knew she was actually there to secure a weapon for a man far more dangerous than Sadler. Every conversation they shared was a tactical minefield of double meanings and unspoken history. Ada's role in the Spain mission served as a narrative mirror for Leon's own evolution. While Leon had found a sense of purpose in protecting the innocent, Ada had embraced a life of pure, detached utility. She was the one who could walk through the fire without getting burned, while Leon was the one who would dive into the flames to save someone else. Their interactions in the castle and on the island highlighted the tragedy of their connection. They were two people who were perfectly suited for each other in terms of capability, but diametrically opposed in terms of morality. Leon's inability to arrest or kill her, despite her obvious involvement in the bioterrorism world, was his greatest weakness. Ada Wong was the variable he could never calculate, the woman who prevented him from ever truly moving on from the night Raccoon City died. Her presence in Spain ensured that even if Leon successfully saved the president's daughter, he would leave the mission with the same hollow, unresolved feeling that had haunted him for 6 years. He was a man who could save the world, but he could never save the woman who had stolen his heart in a parking garage. Part 17, Lord Sadler and Los Iluminados. Osmond Sadler, the charismatic and calculating leader of the Los Iluminados cult, represented a terrifying new evolution in the history of bioterrorism. Unlike the corporate executives of Umbrella, who viewed viruses as products to be sold, or the vengeful scientists who used them as tools for personal godhood, Sadler viewed the Las Plagas parasite as a means of absolute social and political control. He was the architect of a sophisticated form of religious bioterrorism that sought to subvert the very foundations of the modern world. His plan was not to destroy the United States, but to infect the president's daughter, return her to her father, and use the parasite to control the executive branch from within. Sadler represented the umbrella mindset taken to its most logical and terrifying conclusion: the total eradication of individual will in favor of a biological hive mind. Sadler was a uniquely dangerous antagonist for Leon because he didn't just want to kill the agent, he wanted to recruit him. He recognized Leon's incredible skill and viewed him as a potential high-level servant for the cult. Throughout the mission, Sadler taunted Leon through radio transmissions and psychic projections, utilizing the growing parasite in Leon's body to communicate with him directly. This created a sense of psychological invasion that was far more intimate and disturbing than anything Leon had faced before. Sadler wasn't just a monster at the end of a level. He was a voice inside Leon's head, a reminder that the agent was slowly losing himself to the very thing he was trying to stop. The cult leader's confidence was unshakable, born of his absolute control over the ganados and his belief that the blessing of the plaga was the next step in human evolution. For Leon, Sadler was the embodiment of everything he hated about the biohazard world. He was a man who used faith as a shield and biology as a sword, preying on the weak and the desperate to build a kingdom of mindless slaves. The Los Iluminados were not just a group of infected villagers. They were a dark reflection of society, a community where everyone followed a single, corrupt voice without question. Defeating Sadler became more than just a mission objective for Leon. It was a rejection of the idea that humanity could be reduced to a collection of biological puppets. The final confrontation with Sadler, where the leader transformed into a massive multi-legged monstrosity, was the physical manifestation of his inner ugliness. Leon's victory over him was a victory for individual agency and human dignity. However, the shadow of Sadler's plan remained, a chilling reminder that the enemies of the future would not be looking to blow up cities, but to quietly infect the institutions of power and change the world from the inside out. Part 18, Krauser's Betrayal. The revelation that Jack Krauser, Leon's former partner and mentor, was alive and working for the Los Iluminados cult was perhaps the greatest psychological blow of the entire Spanish mission. When Leon first encountered Krauser in the ruins of the island facility, the air was thick with a tension that went far beyond mere combat. This was a long time no see comrade moment that carried the weight of their shared history in South America and the bitterness of Krauser's perceived death. Krauser was not just an enemy. He was a traitor to the code they had both sworn to uphold. He had been the one to kidnap Ashley, use his knowledge of Leon's tactics to bait him into traps, and align himself with Sadler in a desperate bid to regain his physical power. The legendary knife fight that followed was more than a test of skill. It was a brutal clash of ideologies. During their confrontation, Krauser's transformation was revealed to be both physical and spiritual. He had embraced the power of the Las Plagas, allowing his ruined arm to mutate into a massive bladed weapon that made him a formidable opponent, even for an agent of Leon's caliber. Krauser represented the power at all costs mentality, believing that Leon's devotion to duty and his hero complex were weaknesses that held him back from his true potential. Leon, on the other hand, stood as the embodiment of the burden of duty. He fought not for power, but to stop a man who had abandoned his humanity for a biological edge. The fight was a high-speed, visceral dance of steel and blood, a conversation between two men who knew each other's every move and every weakness. For Leon, every parry and every strike was fueled by the pain of a friendship betrayed. Ultimately, Leon was forced to kill his former mentor, a victory that felt more like a profound tragedy than a triumph. As Krauser fell, Leon was left with the grim realization that the man he had once respected was truly gone, replaced by a hollow shell of ambition and resentment. Krauser's death was a warning to Leon. It showed him what happens when a soldier loses his way and begins to value the weapon more than the person wielding it. The betrayal of Jack Krauser ensured that Leon would always be a lone wolf at heart, forever wary of those who stood beside him in the fire. He walked away from the ruins of their fight with a deeper understanding of the corrupting nature of the world they lived in, and a renewed commitment to the idea that he would never let the power of the virus change who he was. He had killed his past so that he could save the future, but the ghost of Jack Krauser would remain a permanent part of his internal landscape, a reminder of the thin line between a hero and a monster, Part 19. The Island Facility and Escape. The final assault on the Los Iluminados Island Research Facility was the absolute pinnacle of Leon Kennedy's 2004 mission, a frantic race against time that saw him facing the most advanced and horrific plaga-based mutations the cult had produced. The island was a sprawling, military-industrial complex where Sadler had refined the parasites for global deployment, and it served as the final barrier between Leon and Ashley's freedom. Every step Leon took was a battle against overwhelming odds as he moved through laboratory wings and military barracks filled with regeneradores and heavily armed ganados. The atmosphere was one of high-stakes, high-tech horror, a far cry from the rustic villages where the mission had begun. This was the heart of the beast, and Leon was there to cut it out. The most critical moment of the island mission was the discovery of the specialized radiation machine, a high-tech device designed to remove the Las Plagas parasites from a human host before they could reach maturity. In a scene of intense vulnerability, Leon had to use the machine first on Ashley and then on himself. The process was agonizing, a physical purging of the biological corruption that had been growing inside them for days. This was the moment Leon truly won the war against Sadler. By removing the parasites, he regained his absolute agency and ensured that Ashley could not be used as a political weapon. With the biological clock no longer ticking, Leon was free to launch his final attack on the cult leader. The subsequent battle with the mutated Osmond Sadler was a masterclass in tactical combat, as Leon utilized every weapon in his arsenal to bring the giant down. As has become a recurring theme in Leon's life, his final victory was assisted by the timely arrival of Ada Wong. In the heat of the final battle, Ada provided Leon with the signature red rocket launcher, the silver bullet needed to finally destroy Sadler's monstrous form. Following the cult leader's death, Ada once again took control of the situation, securing the Plaga sample for herself and initiating the island's self-destruct sequence. She gave Leon the keys to a jet ski and vanished into the fog, leaving him to once again perform a desperate escape from an exploding facility. Leon and Ashley raced across the water as the island collapsed behind them, the roar of the engines and the heat of the fire signaling the end of the mission. They reached the safety of the open ocean just as the sun began to rise, a mirror of Leon's escape from Raccoon City 6 years prior. He had successfully returned Ashley to her father. He had dismantled a global threat, and he had proven himself to be the world's most effective operative. Yet, as he'd watched the smoke rise on the horizon, Leon knew that the sample Ada had taken would only lead to a new cycle of horror. He was a hero who had saved the day, but he was also a man who knew that in his world, the day never truly stays saved. Part 20. Tall Oaks, Killing the President. In the year 2013, nearly 15 years after the nightmare in Raccoon City, Leon Kennedy faced what would arguably become the most traumatizing and soul-crushing mission of his entire career. While serving as a close advisor and bodyguard to his longtime friend and mentor, President Adam Benford, a sudden and massive bioterror attack struck the university town of Tall Oaks. The attack utilized the newly developed C virus, a devastating biological agent that turned the population into a new breed of aggressive, fast-moving zombies. However, the true horror for Leon was not the outbreak itself, but the identity of its first high-profile victim. President Benford was infected in the initial wave of the attack, and Leon was forced to watch as the man who had given him his career and shared his vision for a world without biohazards transformed into a mindless monster. The moment Leon was forced to pull the trigger and shoot Adam Benford in the head to save the life of Agent Helena Harper, was the ultimate test of his commitment to his duty. It was a scene of Shakespearean tragedy. The silver bullet had been forced to kill the very man he was sworn to protect. This act shattered Leon's remaining sense of idealism and left him in a state of profound, silent shock. He didn't just kill a president, he killed his friend, his mentor, and the one man in the government he truly believed in. This was the moment Leon's service to the state became entirely disconnected from any sense of personal loyalty. He realized that the system he had sacrificed everything to protect was fundamentally incapable of protecting the people at its very top. The weight of that single gunshot would haunt Leon for the rest of his life, a permanent stain on his record and his conscience. The aftermath of the shooting saw Leon and Helena Harper branded as fugitives, accused of the president's murder by the very people who had orchestrated the attack. Leon found himself in a familiar and exhausting position. He was a lone man in a burning city, hunted by both the monsters on the streets and the shadows within his own government. His journey through the ruins of Tall Oaks was a grim, mechanical pursuit of the truth, driven not by hope, but by a desperate need for accountability. He teamed up with Helena, a woman whose own secrets and trauma mirrored his own, and together they began to uncover a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of national security. The Tall Oaks incident was the death of the heroic era of Leon Kennedy. He was no longer the agent who saved the president's daughter. He was the man who had killed the president. This act of necessary violence defined the final, cynical phase of his career, proving that in the war against bioterrorism, there are no clean hands, and there is no such thing as a happy ending. He walked out of the ruins of Tall Oaks as a man who had finally seen the absolute limit of his duty, and he found that it was a place of total, suffocating darkness. Part 21, Helena Harper and the Conspiracy. Following the catastrophic assassination of President Adam Benford at the hands of Leon Kennedy himself, the agent found himself tethered to a new and enigmatic partner, Agent Helena Harper. Their journey through the blood-soaked ruins of Tall Oaks was not merely a fight for survival, but a frantic pursuit of a truth that neither was fully prepared to face. Helena was a woman consumed by a desperate, frantic guilt, having been the unwilling pawn in the opening moves of the C virus outbreak. As they navigated the terrifying landscape of a town transformed into a necropolis, Leon was forced to confront the reality that the institutions he had served for 15 years were rotting from the top down. The search for answers led them to the Tall Oaks Cathedral, a place of supposed sanctuary that had been transformed into a twisted laboratory for the family, a secret society that had manipulated the American government for generations. Within the lightless depths beneath the cathedral, the full scale of Helena's tragedy was revealed. She had been coerced into aiding the attack on the president because her sister, Deborah, had been kidnapped and used as a biological test subject. Watching Helena witness her sister's horrific mutation and subsequent death was a mirror to Leon's own history of loss. It reinforced his belief that in the war against bioterrorism, there were no true winners, only victims who had been forced to make impossible choices. The discovery of the family's underground research facility provided the first tangible proof that Derek Simmons, the National Security Advisor, was the architect of the chaos. Simmons represented a new breed of villain, not a rogue scientist or a corporate executive, but a high-level government official who viewed the deaths of 70,000 people as a necessary sacrifice for the sake of national stability. For Leon, this was a moment of profound ideological crisis. He was no longer just fighting monsters. He was fighting the very hand that signed his paychecks. The relationship between Leon and Helena was forged in the heat of a shared trauma that few others could comprehend. They were both fugitives from a system that had branded them as murderers, yet they remained committed to a duty that the system itself had abandoned. Leon's decision to trust Helena, despite her initial deception, was a testament to his maturity as an operative. He saw in her the same spark of humanity that had once driven him in Raccoon City, a desire to do the right thing, even when the cost was unbearable. As they fought their way out of the cathedral and toward the truth, Leon realized that the conspiracy was not limited to the borders of the United States. The C virus was a global threat, and the strings were being pulled by a man who was obsessed with the past. The mission through tall oaks served as a grim reminder that the good guys were often the ones holding the match. By the time they secured transport to China to confront Simmons, Leon had fully embraced his role as a rogue agent of justice, a man who would burn down the very house he lived in if it meant exposing the rot within its walls. Part 22, China and the C virus. The mission transitioned from the localized horror of tall oaks to the sprawling urban nightmare of Lanxiang, China, where a global C virus outbreak was underway on an unprecedented scale. Lanxiang was not just a battlefield. It was a vision of the end of the world, with entire city blocks being consumed by the blue mist of the virus, and the skies filled with the roar of fighter jets and the screams of the infected. Leon Kennedy arrived in China with a singular focus: locate Derek Simmons and stop the spread of the virus before it reached a point of no return. However, the mission was complicated by the presence of another legendary figure in the fight against bioterrorism, Chris Redfield. Their paths crossed in a tense, high-stakes standoff that highlighted the fundamental differences in their approaches to the war. Chris, blinded by a savage desire for revenge against the woman he believed to be Ada Wong, was on the verge of losing his humanity, while Leon remained focused on the broader tactical picture. This confrontation between Leon and Chris was a watershed moment in the law, a clash of two veterans who had seen too much and lost too many. Leon's ability to remain level-headed in the face of Chris's rage demonstrated how much he had grown since his rookie days. He wasn't just a soldier, he was the most grounded operative in the field, a man who could differentiate between a target and a distraction. He knew that the Ada Chris was hunting was a piece of a much larger puzzle, and his intervention likely saved Chris from making a mistake that would have haunted him forever. While Chris led his team into the heart of the military conflict, Leon and Helena pursued the bureaucratic heart of the infection. The urban landscape of Lanxiang provided a brutal backdrop for this pursuit, with Leon fighting through markets, rooftops, and flooded streets against the Javo, infected individuals who retained a level of intelligence and could mutate their limbs into biological weapons in response to trauma. The scale of the C virus outbreak in China was a terrifying glimpse into the future of warfare. It was no longer about localized incidents. It was about the total destabilization of a global power through biological means. Leon moved through this chaos with a grim, mechanical efficiency, his years of training allowing him to survive encounters that would have claimed entire squads of lesser men. He saw the devastation the virus had wrought on the civilian population, and it fueled a quiet, cold anger within him. He realized that the era of Umbrella was truly over, replaced by an era of state-sponsored bioterrorism, where the weapons were as sophisticated as the men who deployed them. As he and Helena closed in on Simmons' location, Leon understood that the fight in China was the final exam for his generation of survivors. They were the only ones who knew the true face of the enemy, and they were the only ones who could stand in the way of a new world order built on the foundation of the C virus. The mission in China was the moment Leon Kennedy became more than a government agent. He became a global guardian, a man who stood at the threshold of the apocalypse and refused to step aside. Part 23. Derek Simmons, the architect. Derek Simmons, the national security advisor and leader of the secret society known as the Family, represented the ultimate corruption of the American state and the darkest shadow of Leon Kennedy's professional life. Simmons was not motivated by profit or scientific discovery, but by an obsessive, pathological desire to maintain order through fear and manipulation. His obsession with Ada Wong, whom he had met years prior, had driven him to commit unspeakable atrocities, including the creation of a clone, Carla Radames, through the use of the C virus. Simmons was the man who had ordered the destruction of Tall Oaks and the assassination of President Benford. Viewing these acts as necessary maneuvers to prevent the president from revealing the government's historical ties to the biohazard world. For Leon, Simmons was the physical manifestation of the system's betrayal, a man who had used the very principles Leon believed in to justify mass murder. The final confrontation with Derek Simmons was a grueling, multi-stage battle that pushed Leon and Helena to the absolute limits of their physical and mental endurance. Simmons, having been infected with an enhanced strain of the C virus by a vengeful Carla Radames, underwent a series of horrific and unstable mutations. He transformed from a human into a beast resembling a prehistoric predator, and eventually into a massive insectoid monstrosity that towered over the battlefield. This battle was symbolic of Leon's entire career. He was fighting a monster that had been created by the very government he served. Each stage of the fight required a different tactical approach, forcing Leon to use everything from heavy weaponry to environmental hazards to bring the giant down. The victory over Simmons was not just a tactical success, but a symbolic rejection of the family's shadow government. By killing Simmons, Leon and Helena were effectively cutting the head off the snake that had poisoned the American executive branch for decades. Following Simmons's death, Leon was finally able to clear his and Helena's names, though the victory was hollow. The world had seen the horror of the C virus, and the stability Simmons had claimed to protect was shattered. Leon's role in stopping Simmons solidified his status as a legendary figure, but it also deepened his growing disillusionment. He had seen the highest levels of government corrupted by the allure of biological power, and he knew that Simmons was likely not the only one. The architect of the chaos was dead, but the blueprint remained. Leon walked away from the battle with a profound sense of exhaustion, knowing that his service to the country had cost him his mentor and his faith in the system. He had stopped the man who tried to play God with the world's security, but he was left wondering if the world was truly any safer for it. The fight against Simmons was the climax of Leon's era as an active agent of the state, a final, violent punctuation mark on a career defined by the cleanup of other men's monstrous ambitions. Part 24. Infinite Darkness. Government Corruption. In the year 2006, between his legendary mission in Spain and the global catastrophe of the C virus, Leon Kennedy was involved in an incident at the White House that would fundamentally alter his perspective on the government he served. Known as the Penam Stan incident, this event began with a mysterious hacking of the White House's classified files and escalated into a full-scale biological attack within the very heart of the American executive branch. Leon, once again the president's chosen protector, found himself investigating a conspiracy that reached back to a localized civil war in the fictional nation of Penamstan. There, he discovered that a unit of American soldiers, the Mad Dogs, had been used as unwitting test subjects for a new kind of biological enhancement, a precursor to the technologies that would later plague the world. The discovery that the United States government was experimenting on its own soldiers was a turning point for Leon. He realized that the good guys were just as capable of umbrella-style atrocities as the corporation itself had been. The Penamstan conspiracy was a masterpiece of state-sponsored cruelty, designed to create a super soldier that could be controlled through biological means. Leon encountered the survivors of this unit, men who had been transformed into monsters and then discarded by the state they had sworn to defend. This realization deepened Leon's cynicism, as he saw the same patterns of secrecy and exploitation repeating themselves at the highest levels of power. He was forced to choose between exposing the truth and maintaining the national stability that his superiors demanded. In a decision that would haunt him, Leon chose to keep the secrets of Penamstan buried, believing that the public revelation of such a betrayal would cause more harm than good. This choice marked the death of Leon's remaining innocence. He was no longer just a victim of the system. He was an accomplice to its secrets. He hid the truth from the public to prevent a political collapse, a move that arguably made him a part of the very corruption he had once fought against. The 2006 incident showed a Leon who was beginning to understand the cold, pragmatic math of national security. He understood that the truth was a luxury that a world threatened by biohazards could no longer afford. His distrust of authority grew into a quiet, simmering resentment as he realized that he was being used as a shield for the very people who were building the weapons. The White House incident was a psychological precursor to his eventual rock-bottom era, showing a man who was slowly being crushed by the weight of the lies he was forced to tell. He was the world's most effective agent, but he was also a man who could no longer look at the American flag without seeing the blood of the soldiers who had been sacrificed in the name of progress. Part 25: Claire's Return and Ideological Split. The 2006 White House incident also served as the backdrop for a painful and permanent ideological split between Leon Kennedy and his longtime friend and fellow Raccoon City survivor, Claire Redfield. Claire, who had dedicated her life to humanitarian work through the organization Terra Save, arrived at the White House with her own evidence of the Penamstan conspiracy. She had seen the suffering of the survivors firsthand and was determined to expose the truth to the world, believing that the only way to prevent future atrocities was through absolute transparency. Leon, however, was operating under the direct orders of the government and saw the situation through the lens of national security. Their reunion was not a celebratory one, but a tense confrontation between two people who had once been on the same side, but had been moved in different directions by the years of conflict. Claire wanted Leon to help her release the evidence of the government's involvement in the Penamstan biological experiments, but Leon refused. He believed that the world was too fragile to handle the truth of such a betrayal, and that exposing the conspiracy would lead to a level of chaos that would only benefit the bioterrorists. This disagreement was more than just a tactical difference. It was a fundamental split in their moral compasses. Claire remained the idealist, the woman who believed in the power of the people and the necessity of justice, while Leon had become the cynic, the man who believed that order must be maintained at any cost. even if that cost was the truth itself. Their split was a death of a friendship moment that highlighted the high personal cost of Leon's career. He was forced to choose his duty to the state over his loyalty to the woman who had survived the hell of Raccoon City by his side. This ideological separation left Leon more isolated than ever before. He had effectively cut himself off from the only person who truly understood what they had been through in 1998. By choosing the government's secrets over Claire's truth, Leon was acknowledging that he was no longer the same person who had escaped the RPD on that emergency train. He had become a part of the machine, a man who functioned in the shadows and who understood that the world was built on a foundation of necessary lies. The pain of this separation was evident in Leon's eyes as he watched Claire walk away, knowing that they could never truly go back to being the team they once were. This split was the final severing of Leon's ties to his past, leaving him alone in a world where the only thing he could rely on was the mission. He had protected the state, but he had lost his best friend, a trade that would contribute significantly to the psychological breakdown he would experience in the years to come. Part 26, Vendetta, Rock Bottom. By the year 2017, nearly 2 decades after the fall of Raccoon City, Leon Kennedy reached a psychological and emotional breaking point that the fans and the law refer to as his rock bottom. The years of constant combat, the loss of his friends, the assassination of the president, and the endless cycle of biological outbreaks had finally taken their toll. Leon was suffering from severe, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder and had retreated into a life of isolation and chronic alcoholism. He was found by Chris Redfield in a bar in a remote location, a shadow of the man he once was. He was exhausted, cynical, and utterly disillusioned, questioning whether anything he had done over the last 20 years had made a single bit of difference. In his mind, the world was trapped in a never-ending cycle of bioterrorism, where for every monster he killed, 2 more were created in a lab somewhere else. This rock-bottom era is a vital part of Leon's story, because it humanizes a character who had often been portrayed as an unstoppable, superhuman hero. It shows that even a man of Leon's incredible resolve has a limit. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity thousands of times, and he had finally begun to see that same darkness within himself. He was drinking to forget the faces of the people he couldn't save, and the weight of the secrets he was carrying. He had become a ghost, a man who felt more at home in a bar than on a battlefield. It took a new and immediate threat, the kidnapping of Rebecca Chambers and the rise of the black market arms dealer Glenn Arias, to pull Leon back from the edge of the abyss. Chris Redfield's arrival was not just a call to action, but a rescue mission for Leon's soul. Chris reminded him that while they couldn't save everyone, they were the only ones who could save anyone at all. The mission against Glenn Arias in New York City served as a brutal form of therapy for Leon. He was forced to put down the bottle and pick up his weapons once again, proving that his skills had not diminished even as his spirit had. The iconic motorcycle chase through the streets of New York, where Leon utilized his signature combat style to take down bioengineered dogs and mercenaries, was a signal to the world that the silver bullet was back in play. However, he was not the same man as before. He was grimmer, more focused on the immediate task, and less concerned with the long-term implications of his actions. He fought with a desperate, visceral energy, as if he were trying to kill his own demons along with the monsters. By the end of the Vendetta incident, Leon had reclaimed his role as a protector, but the scars remained. He had looked into the abyss and realized that while he couldn't leave the fight would never truly leave him. He was a veteran who had found a reason to keep going, even if that reason was as simple as ensuring that another Raccoon City never happened on his watch. Part 27. Death Island, the Veteran Team. In the year 2015, during the Alcatraz mission known as Death Island, Leon Kennedy participated in what would become the ultimate gathering of the world's most experienced bioterrorism survivors. He joined forces with Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Claire Redfield, and Rebecca Chambers to stop a catastrophic biological attack being orchestrated by a man named Dylan Blake. This mission was significant not just for its tactical scale, but for what it represented in the law, the unification of the Big Five veterans. For Leon, this was a moment of homecoming, a rare opportunity to stand alongside the only people on the planet who truly understood the weight of the cross he had been carrying since 1998. Facing a threat that utilized bioengineered drones to deliver a targeted virus, Leon once again proved why he was considered the world's best at what he did. The antagonist of the mission, Dylan Blake, was a former soldier who had been traumatized by a government cover-up. Much like Leon had been in Penamstan, Dylan saw the world as a lost cause, a place where the only true peace could be found through the total eradication of the human species. He was a dark reflection of what Leon could have become if he had allowed his cynicism to turn into nihilism. The battle on Alcatraz Island was a clash of philosophies as much as it was a tactical engagement. Leon, standing with his comrades, represented the choice to keep fighting for a flawed world, while Dylan represented the choice to burn it all down. This mission served as a final exam for Leon, using all his motorcycle combat skills, his precision marksmanship, and his tactical ingenuity to dismantle Dylan's drone network and eliminate the mutated threats. The Alcatraz mission also provided a much-needed moment of reconciliation and connection for the team. Seeing Leon work alongside Claire again, despite their previous ideological split, suggested that their shared history in Raccoon City was a bond that could never be truly broken. The veteran team was a symbol of resilience, a group of people who had been through the fire and had come out as something stronger than they were before. For Leon, being part of this team was a reminder that he was not alone in his struggle. He saw in Jill, Chris, and Claire the same scars and the same resolve that he carried. Death Island was the moment Leon Kennedy reclaimed his role as a pillar of the global defense against bioterrorism. He left the island not as a broken alcoholic, but as a seasoned leader who understood that the only way to survive the nightmare was to face it together. He was a man who had found his place in the world again, standing with his fellow survivors as the last line of defense against the monsters of the future. Part 28. Evolution. Idealist to cynic. The 28-year evolution of Leon Scott Kennedy is one of the most profound and tragic character arcs in the history of survival horror, serving as a case study in the slow, corrosive cost of heroism. When Leon first arrived in Raccoon City as a 21-year-old rookie cop, he was defined by a hero complex and an almost pathological level of idealism. He was a boy who genuinely believed he could save everyone, a man who saw the badge as a sacred trust and the law as an absolute shield. He was the good cop in a world that had no room for goodness. However, the events of that first night systematically dismantled that idealism. He saw the failure of every institution he believed in: the police, the military, the government, and the corporate world. He learned that in the face of a biohazard, the social contract is the first thing to burn. His transition into a government agent was not a choice, but a forced adaptation. He was blackmailed into service becoming a silver bullet for a state that he didn't trust, all to protect the life of a child. This period of his life was defined by the suppression of his emotions and the refinement of his skills. He was rebuilt into a weapon, a man who could navigate a jungle warfare zone or a Spanish village with the same cold, professional grace. By the time he reached his mission in Spain, the idealism of his youth had been replaced by a grim sense of duty. He was no longer trying to save the world. He was trying to complete the mission. Yet, even then, the hero complex remained, manifesting in his desperate need to protect Ashley Graham and his inability to walk away from a fight. He was a man caught between the person he wanted to be and the weapon he had been forced to become. By the time of the global C virus outbreak and the subsequent rock-bottom era, the evolution into a cynic was complete. Leon had seen the highest levels of the American government corrupted by biological power, and he had been forced to kill his own mentor and friend to save a life. He had become a man who expected the worst from humanity and was rarely disappointed. His PTSD and alcoholism were the natural results of a lifetime of being asked to perform the impossible while being told that the truth didn't matter. By 2026, Leon Kennedy is a stoic, lethally efficient veteran who knows that he can only save some, not all. He is the disillusioned protector, a man who still shows up to the fight, not because he believes in the cause, but because he is the only one who can do the job. He is a living embodiment of the struggle to remain human in a world of manufactured monsters, a man who has lost his youth, his innocence, and his peace, but who has gained a level of wisdom and resilience that is unmatched in the field. He is the ghost of the boy he was, haunting the world as the weapon it created. Part 29. Leon's relationships analyzed. To understand Leon Kennedy is to understand the complex, often tragic web of relationships that have defined his emotional landscape over the decades. Chief among these is his connection to Ada Wong, the woman who has served as his original sin and the primary obstacle to his emotional stability. Ada is the person who prevents Leon from ever truly moving on from Raccoon City. She is the one who got away before he even had her. Their relationship is a perpetual game of cat and mouse, a deadly flirtation that bridges the gap between his duty to the state and his devotion to his heart. Leon's inability to treat Ada as a true enemy, despite her mercenary nature, is his greatest moral compromise. She represents the life he could never have, a partnership of equals in a world of shadows. As long as Ada exists, Leon is tethered to the past, forever looking for a flash of red in the fog of every mission. His relationship with Claire Redfield serves as a poignant mirror to his bond with Ada. Claire is the road not taken, the person who represents the morality and the idealism that Leon was forced to abandon. They share a bond forged in the fires of 1998, a connection that is deeper than friendship, but complicated by their different paths. Claire's commitment to humanitarian truth and Leon's commitment to government stability created a painful ideological split that defined their middle years. Yet, she remains his moral compass, the one person whose judgment he truly fears. If Ada is the woman he wants, Claire is the woman he should have been. Their shared history in Raccoon City is the anchor of Leon's soul, a reminder of the person he was before he became a weapon for the state. Furthermore, his roles as a protector for Ashley Graham and a partner for Helena Harper highlight the different facets of his hero complex. Ashley was the success story that kept him from quitting after the Spain mission, a physical proof that he could actually save an innocent person from the fire. His bond with her was one of mutual growth and survival, a rare moment of light in a career of darkness. Helena, on the other hand, represented the shared trauma of the veteran era. She was a woman whose hands were as dirty as his, a partner who understood the weight of the secrets and the pain of the killing. Together, these women represent the different stages of Leon's life. The daughter he needed to save, the partner he needed to trust, and the ghost he could never catch. Leon's relationships are not just personal connections. They are narrative milestones that track his evolution from an idealistic rookie to a cynical veteran. He is a man who is deeply loved and deeply respected, yet who remains profoundly alone, a victim of a career that leaves no room for anything but the mission. Part 30. Leon's psychological journey. The psychological journey of Leon Scott Kennedy is a study in the profound and lasting impact of survivor's guilt. Leon is a man who carries the ghosts of every person he failed to save, from the officers in the RPD to the citizens of Tall Oaks and the soldiers of Penamstan. He lives in a state of perpetual mourning, his mind a gallery of the faces of the dead. This guilt is the engine of his heroism. He puts on the holster every day because he believes that if he stops fighting, the deaths of those people will have been for nothing. He is a man who is trying to pay a debt to the world that can never be fully settled. Research into his character confirms that he suffers from severe, chronic PTSD, manifested in his rock-bottom era of alcoholism and his detached, stoic demeanor in the field. He has witnessed the end of the world multiple times, and the toll it has taken on his psyche is immense. Despite the trauma, the betrayal by his government, and the disillusionment with his mission, Leon Kennedy's defining characteristic is his refusal to quit. He is the living embodiment of the struggle to remain human in a world that is constantly trying to turn people into monsters or statistics. His psychological journey is not one of healing, but of endurance. He has learned to live with the darkness, to incorporate the trauma into his identity, and to use it as a weapon against the very things that caused it. He is a man who has lost his faith in the system, but who has maintained his faith in the value of an individual life. This is the Leon Kennedy way, the belief that even if the world is going to hell, it is worth trying to save just one more person. Leon's legacy is not his kill count or his successful missions, but the fact that he is still standing. He is a survivor in the truest sense of the word, a man who has looked into the abyss and refused to let it consume him entirely. He represents the resilience of the human spirit in the face of biological and political rot. By 2026, he has become a legendary figure, a man whose name is spoken with reverence by a new generation of operatives. Yet, for Leon, he is still just that rookie cop in the motel room, oversleeping his first day and waking up to a world that was already gone. His psychological journey is a circle. He is always trying to get to the RPD on time, always trying to save the city, and always trying to be the hero that saved him when he was a child. He is a beautifully broken man, a hero of the modern age whose greatest victory is the simple fact that he still cares. He is Leon Scott Kennedy, the silver bullet of the human race. And as long as there is a monster in the dark, he will be there to face it. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe if you enjoyed. Thank you again.